Hey everyone, this is Steven with Curvy Woodworking. In this video, I'm going to show you how I put together my computer table with this adjustable drafting table section. Okay, so to get this project started, I got 1.25" slabs, so 5 quarters of walnut. So I got a total of 16 surface area board feet, but times that by the 1.25", this equates to 20 board feet in total. Now for every build, I always start with the highest risk. Now this walnut is worth $300, more or less, something around there. So I'm going to make sure that once I cut it into the final dimensions, I have enough suitable wood that I can make the L portion of the table that you saw at the beginning of my video. My biggest worry is that I'll have cracks or voids I find inside the wood later on, which means I'll have to take potentially a couple of inches off of the ends. Once I complete this, if there are any changes, I can adjust the design accordingly. So the hardest thing about doing glue ups with multiple pieces is when you have a smaller width like I have over here, they're going to go wonky on you when you start to put the clamp pressure on. So to mitigate this, I'm going to be adding these pieces together, 2 for each. I'm going to do a total of 4 glue ups now. I now have a larger surface area. When I put a 2x2 spanning across onto the next piece, it won't bow and warp as much now that I got a solid face plane like I'm going to have after this glue up. Now there's no set amount of clamps necessary per length of board. You just want to make sure that you even out the amount of clamps that you have on the bottom and on the top. If you only have clamps on the bottom, there's a potential that the center of the two will begin to bow up when you put pressure from the outside. Now this walnut is one of the best woods that you can do for glue ups. It's very flexible, you can adjust it easy. If you're dealing with maple or poplar or something more brittle, you're going to find it's really hard to do those final adjustments with each other. So after I'm done taking off the clamps, I'm going to quickly remove the glue, scrape it off, take it through the planer to make sure that I have a perfectly flat surface for the final glue up. Okay, now the glue up is done. I'm going to need to get rid of all of these little beads. I'm just going to be using a scraper to take off the first pass. Then I'll use a rough sandpaper just to smooth it. I'd rather a gully in here so that when I take it through the table saw, the proper points will be the high points and I can smooth it all out later on. Okay, so you may be asking yourself, why did I switch from hardwood over to particle core, which is right over here, which I was just cutting up. Now the reason behind that is the live wood will shrink and expand based off the moisture content in the room. Now I want this to be my drawing table and I want to put a piece of plexiglass on top of that that's going to act as a solid surface. If I put solid wood and securely fasten it to that plexiglass, it would eventually crack the plexiglass. Now I do like the solid wood look, but for the drafting table, I am going to have to keep this particle core as its base. Plexiglass cuts just like wood does. Just make sure that when you're using your table saw, you use a blade that has at least 60 teeth on there, so essentially a fine tooth cutting blade. Okay, time to start with the steel. So I have these leftover pieces. I'm going to be cutting them up into dimensional sections that will be used on the end pieces. I will then install a walnut veneer on the inside to give it that solid body look. Okay, so we cut all the steel in one go. So the next step is I'm going to tack weld everything. So before we get going, I'm going to make sure that I have a chamfer on every single one of these corners. That's going to allow the weld to actually go inside the steel. A lot of the times if you just put a straight butt edge against another piece of steel, you're only actually welding the top surface. So you're only doing the skin weld on top. This is going to make sure I have a structural feel towards it. Okay, now everything is tack welded together. I just put 3 dots on each side of weld. Now I'm going to do a solid bead across the entire face. I'll do a grind to pass through. If there's any other voids, I'll do a touch-up weld and I'll grind it once again. So after I'm done the first pass and I clean it all up, it looks like a solid weld before, but you can see there's a bunch of little cracks that are hidden underneath all the layers of weld. So I'm going to take a second pass through just to do a touch up across these. I'm going to grind it for a second time after. In 4 different locations on the table base, I added these cross bands that you can see me welding right now, just to provide some rigidity. The weld should be enough. This just gives me a little more comfort. Okay, so now this is what the final configuration is going to look like. I need to be able to take it downstairs, so I'm not going to weld on these 2 pieces together. I'm going to be putting some bolts in through here. So I have the clamps on right now. I'll install the bolts, and then when I transport it, I'm going to take the bolts out and I'll reinstall it back at my plate. Quick trick, if you have a lot of steel that you have to go through with a larger bit, your hand might get tired along the way, so use a squeezing clamp on the back end of the drill to help push it through. Okay, now I need to install flaps on the inside of the table. That's going to support the wood panels on the openings. I'll show you where that is. So right now this is going to be on the exterior of the table. I'm going to install 4 flaps along the border, and I'm going to inset a piece of walnut particle core wood in there. In case you're wondering who that is with the bandana, that's our health and safety representative for the shop. Her name is Millie. Okay, so now I have the welding done and I fastened everything together. I'm going to be using a Bondo mix, and I'm going to spread it over all of the weld joints just to put a smooth transition on there. I'm then going to sand it so it looks like a solid piece of steel. Bondo is what they use in body shops so that they can repair the metal surfaces, so I'm going to be using the same product. Now when you're sanding Bondo and steel, make sure that you start at 150 grit. Okay, so now I'm going to be installing these clips, fastening them to the steel structure. After I put the top on, I'm going to be screwing it from the bottom up so that the two are secured to one another. Okay, so the solid slab is going to move. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remount all of these L angles across. I'm going to ream them out in the direction that the wood will either shrink or expand. So it's going to be running along this direction that I'm expecting that movement to happen. Whenever you pick up steel from the fabricator, the supplier, they always leave a thin coat of grease on top of it to prevent rusting on the steel. So right now I'm just going to take some acetone and wipe that off before I spray it. So I'm going to be using an oil rub bronze spray paint, and this actually has a primer with it. Now you might be asking yourself, why am I using a gray primer to begin with? The reason is because I'm not sure if I'll have enough of the oil rub bronze spray paint. There has been a shortage from Rust-Oleum lately. So after I put the gray prime across to protect the steel, I'm then going to focus primarily on the sections you'll see on the table while you're either sitting down or walking by. You're going to see I did miss a couple sections because I ran out of paint, but like I said before, not a problem because everything's protected. Like I was mentioning before, those square steel structures are going to have a walnut piece on the inside. So this is leftover pieces from the drawing table. This is the particle core with the walnut veneer finish. I'm going to cut those to dimensions so they fit right in, and I can attach them to the steel flaps. Now, because I have trouble counting, I'm actually a little bit short on the plywood infill pieces. So I'm going to take 2 scrap pieces of plywood, I'm going to put some biscuits in between there, and I'm going to glue them together, and that's going to give the appearance of a solid surface. I'll use some putty just to mask that joint line in there, but especially because it's tucked away in the back, you shouldn't notice that there's a crease. Okay, so I'm going to be sanding this in 2 portions. On the solid wood, I'm going to start at a 60 grit, and I'm going to go all the way up to a 320 grit. When it comes to the particle core pieces with the veneer, I'm going to start at 220, and I'm just going to finish right there. Main reason is, any higher grit, I run the risk of actually sanding through that top veneer finish and exposing the back piece of wood. Now, I do this for every single project. I've also mentioned in a couple of previous videos, whenever I do sanding, especially when I'm doing multiple grits and I'm doing this for hours, I'm going to be taking a pencil and I'm going to be putting a light scratch mark across the entire surface. Now, when I sand it, I'm going to keep on sanding until that pencil mark disappears, and that helps me keep a consistent sand across the entire surface. Now, to spread the Osmo oil around, I'm going to be using a Bondo scraper just to put an even coat across. I'll use a paintbrush to touch up the ends afterwards, and then I'm going to take around 4 or 5 passes through with the buffing wheel. Okay, so for the tabletop, I used an Osmo oil finish on there, and that helps to better resist against water or heat. So if I have like a hot cup of tea on there, it won't leave a ring. If I were to use the sealer on it, it would leave a ring that I couldn't get out. So That is going to take 4 coats on the top of the Osmo, 2 coats on the bottom. All of these pieces, so these are the side panels, this is the portion underneath the drafting table, so it's protected by the plexiglass, and then this little armrest which won't see any heat. That is all just going to have sealer with 2 coats of a 40% gloss lacquer finish. After I place the sealer coat, I'm going to wait for it to dry before I take a 320 grit sandpaper and scratch the entire surface. Sealer's purpose is to allow any loose fibers in the wood to stand up before you put on the costly lacquer finish. Now, as I mentioned before, I'll be using a 40% lacquer finish on these pieces. Now, mixing it is not rocket science. For every cup of the 40% lacquer, I put around 1/3 of a cup of lacquer thinner that helps it go through the gun easier, and I put around 1/5 of a cup of catalyzer, which helps it set faster. This isn't rocket science. There's not an exact millimeter. It's the difference between setting in 5 minutes or 6 minutes. So to join the plexiglass and the piece of wood, I put a 45-degree chamfer across the entire plexiglass. I put tape on both sides so I won't have any silicone seeping into one another. Now I can put a bead in here around the entire border. It's going to hold everything together, and they're going to be securely fastened to each other. Okay, so the drafting table mechanism. So right now I can adjust this table and you can see the product that I'm using to hold it into place. It has these little teeth in here. Now when I pick it up, it'll lock into those teeth. If I want to lower it back down, I just extend it fully up and it flattens straight back down. Thanks for watching this video on how I put together this drafting and computer table setup. Now, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to subscribe, hit that alert button so you can see our upcoming builds, and of course, like this video.